Hi, everybody. My name is Arpit Chaturvedi. I am the Joint Director of the Global Policy, Diplomacy and Sustainability Fellowship. I also head a think tank called Global Policy Insights and an environmental consulting firm called EnviPol. Global Policy Insights is our fellowship which brings you a whole range of courses, a whole range of mentors from the UN, from the best of the universities in the world, from NATO, from the World Bank, from all of the top organizations, including some really famous NGOs, private sector companies, and even politicians, ministers, MPs from all over the world. And our applications are opening soon, so I would request you to check out the GPODS fellowship on the link that my colleague Shrishti has just shared over there. But today we are also here to discuss something extremely important. We are living in times where there is a war going on. The new IPCC report has come out, and overall, if I were to sum up in somewhat simplistic terms, and I'm sure a lot of you might agree, things are not looking great. Whether we are looking at public policy, whether we are looking at sustainability, whether we are looking at the environment, things are not looking really great on depending on the way that we are going right now. And what I'm here to talk to you about is to understand how people think about public policy and how public policy should actually be made. And I'm not saying in a prescriptive manner that public policy should be made in a certain way and not in a certain manner. What I'm here to tell you is that there are different mental models of how public policy is made. A lot of times, the bureaucracies or the current orthodoxy in policy thinking makes it extremely simplistic, straight cut, and not fit to context. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is something that I call the frameworks of public policy and the mental models around it. Let me just quickly share my screen and jump right into the topic. All right, I'd request some of us to keep their cameras on. So thank you so much, Sylvia, for keeping your camera on over there. Hello. And thank you so much, Cheng, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Nasir, Anisha, Ibsa. So good to see you over here. All right. So, and Rosie and Sudhir, thank you. Okay. So are you all able to see my screen? Perfect. Okay. So this is what we call a policy cycle. And, it starts with the idea that public policy always starts with some sort of an agenda. There's some problem which is identified, and on that you have a policy agenda almost appearing miraculously on your plate, whether it is about taxing the rich, or whether it is about cap and trade for carbon emissions, or it could be about making your own neighborhood safe by planting a number of cameras around it. There is always some sort of an agenda, and based on that agenda you formulate policy. That's the second stage, which is the formulation stage of the policy. After that policy has been formulated, you figure out that, okay, what is the impact that you're looking at for this particular policy. You adopt that policy and implement it. Okay, so you bring in all the resources which are possible to implement that particular policy on the ground. Once it's implemented, you monitor it, you evaluate it. Once the evaluation is done, there's some course correction which takes place over there. You support the policy, and then whatever policy you've implemented would have some positive and negative externalities, or some things, some gaps which are still not fulfilled, and that a lot of times gives rise to newer agenda or new aspects of the agenda that you've been dealing with. Okay, so this is the usual way of thinking about how policies are made. And I am going to tell you that this is almost absolutely wrong. This is not how policies are made in the real world. Why? Because if you notice this particular chart that you have, this particular figure that you have in front of you, despite the fact that it's circular, it's really quite linear. It neatly moves from one stage to another and then to another, and very logically avoid skipping any stages. It is almost unreal. It is not how policies really function. It is not how policies are really formed. So how are policies really formed? It's an excessively messy process. It is not a process which can be laid down very easily on a map like this. And to, I think, a great attempt of that at that process is done by John Kingdon when he talks about his multiple streams analysis. And what John Kingdon says, he doesn't really produce a pictorial for that. This is just, somebody trying to show what John Kingdon's analysis looks like. It's actually much more haphazard than this. What John Kingdon essentially says is that for any particular policy action to happen, there are three streams that you need to activate. Okay, and think of it like three streams of river coming together. One is the problem stream. Okay, so I'm really bad at drawing, but then I'm still going to give it a try. There is a problem stream. There is a policy stream. Oops, I told you I'm really bad at this. And the third one is a politics stream. Okay, so what John Kingdon is saying that these three streams, the problem stream, the policy stream, and the politics stream, they all come together, and that opens a policy window. And when people are able to take advantage, when there are policy entrepreneurs who are pushing a particular agenda through that window, it is only then a particular policy finds some sort of an implementation on the ground. Now, that's the 30,000 feet view of John Kingdon. What John Kingdon is essentially saying is as follows. John Kingdon is essentially saying that there are a million, billion, trillion of problems that are there in any particular society, which are latent agendas. They could be potential agendas in a particular society. Okay? And a lot of times, all of these agendas cannot be legislated upon. All of these agendas cannot find somebody who's making a policy in the legislature or in any relevant body in a particular country or in a particular jurisdiction. So how does that happen? And John Kingdon says that a lot of times the way that it happens is that there are groups of people who highlight this problem. These could be journalists, these could be activists, these could be a whole range of people who first highlight a particular problem which becomes important enough to legislate upon. A lot of times what happens is that there are problems which are there. Think of the legislature as this spotlight which could fall upon any particular policy and or any particular issue, any particular problem, and to whatever problem this spotlight falls on, you will find policy action on those particular problems. So how do you get the spotlight on a particular problem? There are people, there are activist groups, journalists, or people who've been affected. They literally work hard and work through various means, sometimes by accident, but a lot of times deliberately, to highlight a particular problem. Okay, so for example, if I were to tell you, in New Delhi, a lot of times it doesn't happen by accident. It's just the nature of things. In New Delhi, you find excessive pollution during the winters because Delhi is close to a farming state called Haryana and Punjab, and they literally burn their crops for a number of reasons. I'm not getting into the weeds of it. They burn their crops, and the wind which is coming from that direction into Delhi creates, it gets trapped into Delhi because of its demography, and it becomes a literal smokehouse. So for those 2 months, when that happens, November, December, the policy agenda for pollution really goes up the ladder, on the priority ladder. Okay, so a lot of times these problems are identified because of natural sources. A lot of times these find the right sort of activists. Okay, so that's the problem stream. But having a problem stream is just one part of the story. Having this stream activated, let's say, water flowing in the stream, that's just a little part of the story. What else do you need? You need also the policy stream to get activated. And what that means is that for any given problem, you could have a whole range of policy options. Typically, experts, in the government, in the private sector, in the civil society, analysts, etc., come together and they present various policy alternatives to a particular problem. And you could see it in the case of clean air itself, or air pollution itself, where one way to deal with air pollution is that I could outrightly ban any industry or any source of pollution, okay, which is causing pollution. So that's the outright ban policy option. I have that as one alternative. Another alternative that I have is that I could really tax the industries which are polluting, or tax the products which are creating pollution, such as automobiles, etc., etc. Okay, and there as well, I could either go with a consumer pays principle or a producer pays principle. Or what I could do is that I could ask nations to trade carbon between each other. So, or ask states to trade carbon between each other. So let's say if Costa Rica is not producing a lot of pollution, then I'm going to buy carbon credits from Costa Rica and pay that amount of money to Costa Rica to keep the environment neat and green while I go on polluting. Okay. And that is one way to offset, or at least minimize or optimize the amount of pollution which we are throwing out in the world. Now, if you look at all of these different alternatives, these are various, forms of policies. There could be so many different policies that could be formulated on this exact same agenda. The problem is air pollution, and we talked about at least 3 to 4 policies which could probably address this particular problem. For each of these alternatives, there are winners and losers, right? So if I'm banning pollution-making industries altogether, then the industries are losers, are the biggest losers, probably the consumers as well to some extent. If I'm doing a cap and trade sort of a thing, then a lot of times, people who are, let's say, Costa Rica and India are trading carbon credits, where India is going on polluting while paying Costa Rica for that particular thing. So over there, the public of India, who's still breathing some amount of dirty air, is still the loser. Essentially, whatever you do, whatever policy that you talk about, there are always winners and losers in various policy alternatives. And there's a whole politics of policy making. There's a whole politics that goes around between these potential winners and losers, between all of these stakeholders. And a lot of times that policy does not, that politics does not work out. There's no clear winner, there's no clear loser. And, the politics stream never gets activated. A lot of times you have a clear winner or a loser in that particular game, and you see the politics stream also getting activated. And when all of these 3 streams come together, you have a window of opportunity. Even then, even when you have a window of opportunity, you don't have a guarantee that you'll eventually find a particular policy to see the day of the light of day. You need, at this point of time, policy entrepreneurs. In fact, right from the beginning somewhere, you need policy entrepreneurs to try and bring all of these streams closer. Okay, and a lot of times what's also happening is that these streams are crisscrossing between each other. Okay, a lot of times there's a lot of back and forth. You had some sort of a political winner, but then that policy is probably not the best policy. So you'll find ways to improve that policy alternative. Eventually, a lot of times you'd see that the final policy which is implemented does not really solve the problem at all. Okay, because it just transforms so much throughout the process that it's now totally something else. And you would see that in, for example, the goods and services tax code in India, where it was envisioned for another purpose, and the final bill that became an act in 20 years after contestation was absolutely something very different. But now what happens is that over here, the policy entrepreneur is almost standing on a goalpost. If the policy entrepreneur is able to weave together the problem, the policy, the politics of it, then they're able to score a goal, and you have some sort of an legislation, some sort of an implementation of that policy. Okay. If not, then a lot of these agendas, if let's say this policy entrepreneur is not able to hit the goal post, then these agendas, they die off again. And a lot of research says that it then takes about 2 to 3 decades to again get the problem stream, the politics stream, the policy stream aligned, so that you can have policy action all over again and get something done. So the question over here is that how do you bring all of these things together? How do you bring all of these things together? And it's important to understand what lies beneath the problem stream, the politics stream, and the policy stream. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem stream, after which we will move to the policy stream and the politics stream together. Okay. So when we are talking about problems, okay, and this I'm talking about another political scientist called Luke Stevens. And he has written this phenomenal book called The Three Faces of Power. You should look it up. What he says, literally, think about power having three masks, one over the other. And he says that power has three faces. The first face of power is what you see out there on the ground. The first face of power is the set of things on which people are already contesting. The politics stream, you could look at the politics stream and you could understand that those agendas are under discussion. So for example, in India, you saw a lot of farm laws being contested out on the streets. There were people protesting. There were people who were opposing the protesters. So it's quite apparent out there in the open. And eventually one party wins, one party loses, and there is a legislation on it. Okay. So that's the first phase and the most obvious phase of power, where you already see a contestation of interests happening on the ground. The second phase of power is the really, it's the more insidious phase of power. And that's the phase of agenda control. And that power lies with the media, that lies with the legislature, wherein, it's the power to not talk about something. So let's say, if you're in a really conservative nation, you might not LGBTQ rights, or you may not have any discussion in the legislature about creating a policy for mental health. There are problems which are identified by people, but there is really no discussion. It hasn't seeped, those problems haven't been able to penetrate the narrative for one reason or the other. Okay. And there are many examples of it throughout the world, wherever you see some populations which have been oppressed by other populations, the issues of the oppressed population do not surface up in the media at all. Now with social media, that's different. But even now, a lot of times you'd find certain agendas or problems that never are discussed by any particular legislature at all. I'm going to pause here for a moment, and I'm going to garner some responses from the audience about any examples, if you can think of some, of problems which are there in the society. People know that there are these problems which exist, but the legislature is not talking about it. Nobody's writing bills on it. Nobody in the media is talking about it. The civil society, talks about it only in a limited hush-hush manner. Some examples of that. Ishwarya, so good to see you over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I believe like the fisherman issue, the fishermen from Tamil Nadu being arrested frequently by the Sri Lankan government,
Okay.
but I don't see any solid law which governs, protects the fishermen. So that's one thing.
Awesome. That's one. Andres over here says homelessness. Not a lot of people are talking about homelessness. In fact, you'd find states which have never ever legislated about homelessness at all. Let me get Mevo.
Hello.
Hi, Mevo.
Hi, sir. Sir, if I talk about here in Pakistan, then we would like to know about the problems of society. Like minorities are facing so much problems, and even in the National Assembly and the Provincial Assembly, there have been so many bills, but the implementation of those bills is still lacking behind. So that is the problem.
Absolutely. So, a classic example of minority issues never being discussed at all. Let me go get Ferial. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, that's correct. It's Ferial.
Okay. Thank you.
So one of the issues that I recently, well, not recently, but became aware of was, for example, sacred land. We have a situation. I live in Scotland, but I'm originally from South Africa, so I help some of the things over there. And there's a piece of land that Amazon right now is wanting to build their head office on for all of Africa, I suppose. But it is a piece of land that is so sacred to what we call the Khoi and the San people. And the problem with this is that the people in the world, we don't realize that we all share DNA of the Khoi San people. So we think it is the problem of South Africa, but actually Amazon is coming in to defile basically sacred ground for humanity.
No, and you should write about it and, just send it over to me and we'd be happy to publish it in the right places.
We're really trying to get some stuff out there. So that would be the one thing. The other thing for me is, as much as women have made a lot of strides in the West and in certain countries, there are still things we don't talk about in certain nations where women still are seen as these second-class citizens.
Oh, absolutely. So I saw a response over here which said that, in a particular country, you don't talk about menstrual hygiene at all. So, yeah.
I've been so proud of Scotland. They've actually made all our menstrual products free for women, because of the first country in the world, because, it has to be something that's important. We all have mothers and they have vaginas and they have babies.
So that's an agenda which has seen all of the streams coming together for Scotland. But no, thank you so much for your responses. And, I'm also looking at some great responses in the chat box. Thank you so much. Eliminating child labor in the informal sector. Absolutely. So many examples of problems where the sufferers have a clear realization of the problem, but it never penetrates into the agenda. That's the second phase of power. Okay. So that's the second types of problems that you're dealing with. The third phase of power is, and there's a fine distinction between the second one and the third one. So listen carefully over here. The third phase of power is the most insidious one, and it's the most hard to identify. The third phase of power is that where you do not allow the afflicted to even realize their interests. Okay, it might sound weird. Some of you do understand it already, but let me give you an example. Think about 19th century Victorian women in the UK. You're wearing these tight corsets. You're just discouraged from joining the labor force. The lady is supposed to be the angel of the house, etc., etc. So these women are clearly not working in their rational self-interests, but under the weight of ideology, they are thinking that they are, by doing so, by sacrificing their interests, they are serving the larger society, or they are serving even themselves. And that's the power of ideology. Those are the sort of problems which are hardest to pluck out. Okay, it's extremely hard to make those problems apparent, and it's because the sufferers, a lot of times, and there's research that says that a lot of times the sufferers know that they're suffering, but there are so many rationales that have been fed into them that they're able to rationalize their suffering very well. Okay, so, and that also happens, in oppressive groups. That, if you are part of the oppressive group, that eventually it's going to, you have the examples of, Nazi Germany. You have so many different examples where extreme oppression ends in a crisis. Okay, but a lot of times you've been brainwashed to rationalize in a manner where what you're thinking seems exactly right to you and seems in the interest of the larger society. Okay. Now, when that happens, this becomes an extremely difficult, idea to pluck out of people's mind. Now, let me give you an example of, a live example of this. You see this a lot of times in insurgencies. So let's say you're dealing with insurgents in some part of the country, okay, or you're dealing with some folks who are dissatisfied with the country, they want to separate, etc., etc. Okay, what typically governments do is that their policy prescription is to start building roads in that area, start building schools in that area, start essentially looking at it from the lens of interest, that if we fulfill the interests of this particular community, the rational interests of this particular community, then they are eventually going to come over to our side. That sometimes happens, but a lot of times what's ignored is that people who are insurgents, or people who are under the influence of a very strong ideology, would not entertain the roads, the schools, the benefits that you're giving to them, because in their minds, the third phase of power's characteristic is that you interpret your interests differently. You interpret your interests based on something which has been fed to you by some ideology, okay, not your rational interests. So a lot of times when a government will give you the roads, will give you the schools, you will start thinking that, hey, must be something, they are eventually going to harm me, because that's the ideological spell that you're in. And then people would start boycotting those schools, people would start destroying those roads. And as a response to that, what the government is going to do is that the government is going to literally be like, we did so much for them, and we spent so much of our taxpayers' money in building those roads and building those schools, but these folks only understand the power of force, and they are not taking our facilities that we are giving them. And what ensues is a never-ending sort of a contestation and a battle between the government and those particular insurgents. What the governments fail to understand is that the turf on which you need to address this particular issue is the turf of mental models. The turf is psychological and not rational interest based all the time. Okay. So when we talk about the problem stream, you have to understand that a lot of times to activate a particular problem stream, you would have to see through these three phases of power. That, is this interest or is this particular problem realized by people very clearly, and there are groups for it, against it, there are winners and losers aligning, or it is the phase of power where people have realized their interests very clearly, but their agenda is not able to penetrate through the narrative, okay, through the wheel that the power holders hold. Okay, that's the second phase. And the third phase is that, are they interpreting their own interest against their rational interests? Okay, so you have to employ different strategies for these different phases of power. Okay, And that would activate your problem stream more effectively. Okay. Now, let's come to the policies. Okay. Now, when we're talking about the policy stream, we are talking about a particular framework that I'm particularly fond of. And this was actually created by Professor Theodore Lowy at Cornell. I also attended the same institution, but Theodore Lowy was not teaching at that point of time over there. And his framework was modified, slightly improved upon by Professor Wilson. And eventually what you have over here is called the Lowy-Wilson matrix. Okay, I'm going to take a few questions before I get into this. Isn't it using force? Okay, let me see. Isn't it using force as also part of taxpayers' money, activating special powers? Absolutely, it is. Absolutely. And things like accepting domestic violence amongst women, whenever you have that sort of an acceptance that, this is how things are, and this is, you need to do that to keep the social order going. That's exactly the third phase of power. So I think you guys are following pretty well over here. So now we are talking about the politics and policy streams. Now, to understand the politics and policy stream, what you have is the Wilson-Lowy matrix. And essentially, one way, a good way to interpret this matrix is that certain policies and certain politics, they go very well together. Okay. And a lot of times politics can trigger policy. A lot of times policy can also trigger politics. So it's like, if you remember this bit, these streams doing sort of a back and forth. This can trigger this as well, and this can trigger the other one as well. Okay. So what essentially the Lowy-Wilson matrix is talking about is that there are essentially these 4 types of policies. Okay. And these 4 types of policies are as follows. The first one is redistributive policies. Okay. Redistributive policies are simply take from a few and give it to some other few. Okay. Take from one, give it to another. Okay. So over here, the costs are the costs are concentrated amongst the few from whom you're taking. The benefits are also concentrated to the people whom you're giving. Okay. So you take from few, you give to another few. Okay. These are redistributive policies, and they give rise to interest group politics. A lot of times interest group politics can also, throw up. Usually interest group politics will throw up redistributive policies. Okay. So, it goes both ways. But I typically, what Professor Theodore Lowy says, that policies, that was his innovation. A lot of times people would think that politics always throws up policy. His innovation in that paper was that policy can also throw up, cause a certain brand of politics. Okay. So that's redistributive policies and interest group politics. The other is distributive policies, right over here, the bottom left cell. The distributive policies essentially are that you're taking from many and you're giving it to a few. Okay. So the costs are widely distributed and the benefits are concentrated. So let me give you an example of that. Let me first give you an example of a redistributive policy, progressive taxation. Okay. So take from the rich, give to the poor, a classic redistributive policy. All right. A distributive policy, on the other hand, would be something like this, that let us have an 1% cess for education. So every taxpayer will give 1% extra. So a lot of people are paying, and only the beneficiaries of education, the students, the teachers, etc., they are benefiting. So it's, it's a V-shaped sort of a thing, that it's a funnel sort of a thing, that you take from a lot and you give to a few. Or if I say that you set up a new ministry for the elderly in your country, because there's not so much policy making happening for the elderly. So if I'm setting up a ministry for the elderly, I'm taking money from the public budgets and I'm dedicating all of that to that ministry for the elderly. So the beneficiaries are only the elderly, the immediate beneficiaries, while it's taken from the state budget. So a lot of people have paid in for that. Okay, so again, taking from a lot of people and giving it to a few. Okay, that's distributive policies, and that leads to client politics. And a lot of times client politics is good, a lot of times client politics is bad. It could go either way. So if you're talking about politics related to elderly care, that could be good. A lot of times, client politics could be just outright corruption. Okay, Aishwarya, go ahead, ask your question, please.
Hi, Arpit. Thank you so much. I just wanted to chip in terms of the multiple streams framework and what we're talking about client politics. So my question basically is feeding into political clientelism could also be a way of opening up my policy window, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. It goes both ways.
Right. Because a lot of the policies that have come up in India for the past, I think, few years had a lot to do with political clientelism. And the swift.
And when you have societies where there's a lot of political clientelism, automatically policymakers start thinking about distributive policies.
Right.
That's like the top of the mind recall when they're talking about policy solutions.
Right, because the underpinning of those policies has a lot of the color is very to serve a few and to ensure that the vote bank is taken care of.
Certainly.
And the speed at which these policies come through is also astonishing and just goes on to prove the point at times.
Certainly. And one good way to look at distributive policies is that often, not always, they come with the setting up of some new agency. A lot of times that happens. So let's say if, during COVID, I had disagreed with, in a particular panel with other policy experts, where there were discussions around that in India during COVID, after COVID, we should create a permanent bureaucracy just to manage health, just like an Indian health services. And my argument was that that's a really bad idea, because we know through data that a lot of times these bureaucracies, the dedicated bureaucracies, they are extremely inefficient, and it just benefits a few people and makes them nobility for life. And they're really, really, not held accountable by themselves or by the public, because unlike politicians, bureaucrats in India cannot be voted out.
Right.
Okay. So I was absolutely against that idea, but then this was a classic example of a client politics where you're setting up a particular agency or a particular body where you're taking it from the budget and then eventually just serving a few.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Aishwarya. All right. And then you have this third sort of a policy and politics combination, which is the regulative policy, entrepreneurial politics. Regulative policies are where costs are concentrated and benefits are widely distributed. So let's say I am taxing cigarettes in my country, okay? Because I have data which shows that cigarettes is really harmful to people's lungs and health outcomes, etc., etc. So who am I? Who's paying the lion's share of the cost? It's the cigarette manufacturers or the cigarette suppliers, etc., etc. That supply chain, literally. Okay? But the benefits are widely distributed across people. Okay, the benefits, you and I and everybody who averted smoking cigarettes are being benefited. Okay, by the way, price elasticity of cigarettes is really, really low. So a lot of times you have to tax it a lot to reduce the consumption by a little. Okay, but that's a different matter. But essentially, regulative policies, when we talk about regulations, it's really about putting the costs on a few and benefits on many, many different people. Okay, and finally, there is majoritarian politics, which comes with constituent policies. And these are the ones where the costs are widely distributed and the benefits are also widely distributed. Anybody wants to give an example of this one, where the costs are widely distributed and the benefits are also widely distributed among people? Anybody who wants to give it a shot? Okay, I have some. Okay, road toll. Okay, let me just take a few of these over here. So road toll, the costs are, yeah, I think that's a good one but not really. I mean, costs are only distributed among the people who are using it. Benefits are also concentrated on the people who are using it. So road toll is, I would say that it's a, I don't know. Yeah, maybe road toll is that. UK NHS system, that's a great one because everybody is a beneficiary and everybody pays into it. Okay, that's a really good one. That's purely majoritarian politics and constituent policies. You've created health as a new constituency of people to vote on. Okay. Now, there comes a particular question over here, and this is where I would invite some responses, or you could raise your hands, and this is just like a pop quiz. Out of these 4 types of policies, if you're a policy entrepreneur, which one, and it's not a rule of thumb, I'm just talking logically, we have some evidence on it, but then it's not conclusive evidence still. But which type of policy, if you're a policy entrepreneur, which type of policy is the easiest to pass in a legislature? Redistributive, distributive, regulative, or constituent? What type of policy is the easiest to pass in the legislature? Okay. I'm seeing a lot of regulative, constituent, regulative, constituent, regulative. Okay. Apurva, do you want to tell us why regulative? Or anybody who wants to tell us what's your logic behind saying regulative is the easiest to pass? You can unmute yourself, please. Raise your hand and we'll make sure that we allow you to unmute yourself. IPSA, all right. Shrishti, if you could, yeah. Oops. Try again, sorry. I'm going to hit, yeah, go ahead.
My guess is that when your costs are being widely distributed, no particular interest group feels attacked or feels like the burden is falling on them. And obviously, it is easier to please a smaller interest group with.
So your answer is regulative or your answer is distributive?
The one where costs are widely distributed. Sorry.
Okay, costs are widely distributed.
Yeah. I think
benefits
would be concentrated.
Perfect. That's the right answer. Yes. Distributive policies are the easiest to pass. And IPSA, why don't you finish with the reasoning, because you're there on the right track. Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, I misread the chart, but yeah, essentially what I mean is that it's easier to, the more diversity you have, the more different the interests will be. So it's easier to please a smaller interest group with a limited set of interests, and put the cost on many people to kind of push it.
Absolutely.
But I do have as I say that, I'm also very conflicted because, like, would the reservation system be an example of this? And that clearly is very unpopular. So
are you talking about affirmative action?
Yeah.
That's redistributive.
Okay.
Because you're in a way taking from one and giving it to another, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah, but
that's interest group politics, not client politics. There's a thin difference between these two. Okay. So over here, you said it absolutely correctly. It's easiest to pass distributive policies because you have benefits concentrated, which means that you have at least a group which is your strong supporter, and you have costs distributed, which means that you don't have any concentrated group who's going to oppose you. All right. a lot of times that can turn out to be a really, really bad thing. A lot of times it's a good thing. A lot of times it can turn out to be a really, really bad thing. And let me tell you how it can turn out to be a really, really bad thing. Okay. Okay, let me just see Triambak's question over here. But isn't there more dialogue and more chances for conflict in the case of distributive policies? No, not really, because the costs are so little and they are so widely distributed that people don't even realize that they are paying, a substantial cost, because there's so many people. Imagine $100 of cost being distributed amongst 1,000 people as opposed to just 10 people. So if 1,000 people have to pay into that $100, then everybody is just paying a little. So marginally, it makes very little difference on anybody. Okay, Ismaila is saying constituent policies would be the easiest. Ismaila, why do you think that? Maybe that's the last response, and then I'll move forward. Ismaila, you want to raise your hand, and then we'll be able to unmute you. Can't find Ismaila. All right, Ismaila and Feril, I'll just come over to you after that. Yeah. Go ahead, Ismaila. No, we can't hear you. Do you want to type in your answer in the chat box? Okay, meanwhile, I'll take Feril's question or response.
Response was
Sorry. No, Ismaila, your voice is breaking quite a lot. Do you want to type it out, please?
So my response was that I understand.
Sorry about that. Ismaila, we are just going to mute you, but we want to hear from you in the chat box, please.
So my response was that I think constituent policy as well, because here you having everyone benefit and everyone contributing, right? So it's so I'm not wanting to contribute if I'm going to be benefiting. However, I almost feel it's on the same footing as distributive, because distributive essentially is eventually I will benefit. For example, if it's for the aged or for, so eventually, so I'm okay with that. But really the one that's the easiest is when I'm personally benefiting. So that's why I would say constituent.
Okay. I mean, I'll give you an example and let's figure out whether constituent might be easier than distributive. And that's where I was headed to anyway. So one of my favorite books has been Manker-Olson's Logic of Collective Action, as well as Manker-Olson's Rise and Decline of Nations. Okay. And what Manker-Olson says is that nations, I'll get into the whole talk about cooperation. He essentially says that nations that see a lot of cooperation internally, they rise, and nations that see lesser of that cooperation internally, they decline. Now, look at his logical flow, what he's talking about. Number one, what Olson is saying, that small groups typically are more successful in pushing their policy agendas as opposed to larger groups. Okay. Why? A small core group, of course, because it's harder to free ride in a small group. Okay. It's easier to communicate in a small group. It's easier to figure out people's contribution in a small group and then reward them accordingly. Okay. So small groups tend to be more successful than larger groups, okay, in pushing their policy agenda. And the next step gets a little darker. where Mankar Olson says that small groups which are badly motivated tend to be more successful than small groups which are motivated for the larger public benefit. Okay. He doesn't say that in these exact words, but if you read the logic, that's his core problem of collective action. Why? Because let's compare two small groups. One is a bad small group. We're just going to call it a bad group. Another is a good small group. We're just going to call it the good group. Okay. Both of them are small. Let's say we are dealing with a problem of taxation. Okay. So it's a tax policy we are dealing with. The bad group wants to create a loophole in the tax system. Okay, that's what their agenda is, that they want to play the tax system, create a loophole in it for their benefit. The good group wants to seal a loophole in the tax system. Okay, they want to, for the larger benefit of the public, they want to seal a particular loophole which is harming a lot of people. Okay. Now, between these two groups, who do you think is going to be more successful? What this logic says is the bad group, and how it does it is as follows. Think about incentive compatibility. Incentive compatibility means is that as rational human beings, and I know we've all read our behavioral economics, etc. We are not purely rational. We operate under bounded rationality, but still this logic applies that as rational human beings, we chase incentives. We want to maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain. Okay. Now, the badly motivated group looks at the whole problem in this manner, that, okay, I will have to spend some money, spend some effort, do a lot of lobbying, etc. So I'll incur some costs, but I would gain disproportionate benefits out of the loophole that I create, okay, or that we create. Okay, we will, once we create a loophole in this tax system, we will be disproportionately benefited, while the costs would be dispersed amongst the larger population. The costs would be distributed across the nation, right? And so much so that not, people would hardly notice. It's just a little bit of a pain, it's marginally costly for people, so they're not even going to notice. So the costs are going to be distributed. Okay, think of it this way. Costs are widely distributed and benefits are quite concentrated. Okay, for the bad group. For the good group, how do the incentives align? Okay, for the good group, they're going to think that we are going to bear a lot of the expenses. We are going to be lobbying with people. We are going to be, paying all of the costs. We are going to be doing all of the hard legwork to close this particular tax loophole that we are facing. So all of the costs in that manner, they are concentrated upon us. Okay. While once the loophole closes, the benefits are distributed across the public. The benefits, everybody benefits, and they don't even realize that they've benefited just so marginally, just so little, that it's not even meaningful to them a lot of times. So if you do a pure, cost benefit analysis, if you talk about incentive compatibility, which of these groups do you think will work harder, or which of these groups have incentives aligned more perfectly than the other? It's the bad group, right? It's the bad group. So what Mankar Olson says is that typically what happens in nations is that a lot of these badly motivated small groups, they keep rising. It's almost like, in a pond, you have algae that keeps accumulating. So a lot of these bad groups which are exploiting the system, and while exploiting the system, they are distributing all of the costs onto the people and concentrating all of the benefits onto themselves. Okay. And people never realize because costs are so distributed. And more of such bad groups, they start coagulating. And at one point of time, what happens is that the costs become so much, even though they're distributed, but the costs become so much for the whole of the society that it starts declining, and someday it stops functioning. And then there are wars, there's revolution, there's all sorts of things. There are exceptions to this as well. There are countries who've been able to create joint coalitions and have been able to escape this sort of a trap. But a lot of times you get stuck in that sort of a trap. But what it at least shows you that policies where costs are widely distributed so that people don't just realize that they're paying a cost so much, and the benefits are concentrated. These are the sort of policies that are easiest to pass. Okay. Now, that's the reason why you see a lot of your rivers polluted. That's the reason why why you see a lot of your air polluted, etc., because over the years we've been transferring the cost to the larger population, while some sections of the society are benefiting. And it's really hard. You literally need people who are irrational at some level. So a lot of times irrationality is not the worst thing. You need people who are irrational at some level to really say that, okay, we are going to bear the costs, even though the benefits are widely distributed, we're still going to do it. Okay. So there, what you see, Ismaila is saying this is exactly what's happening in Nigeria, and in, I think, most parts of the world, really. So, or at least in many parts of the world. So a lot of times this happens that, costs are concentrated and, benefits are widely distributed. So regulative policies also come in, and not all of the times regulative policies are nice, or not all of the time they're always bad. But typically the thing is that these are really hard. Okay. Because you have one strong opponent when you're doing regulative policies. You have one strong opponent whose costs is concentrated, and no staunch supporter because benefits are so distributed. So you need a lot of entrepreneurship in order to get these policies to pass. Okay, so that's the story until now. Now, let me take some questions, some thoughts, some comments before we move forward. Anybody can raise your hands and then we move forward. All right. So everything clear until now, I'm assuming. So now I'm going to move to another part of what we are talking about over here. Okay. And this is where the toll road example comes in.
Hi, I just have a small doubt.
Sure.
So who exactly are the policy entrepreneurs here, and how exactly are they going to fit themselves into this policy making chart?
Okay, so a policy entrepreneur could really be anybody. The policy entrepreneur could be it doesn't have to be a politician all the time. A lot of times, a technocrat could be a policy entrepreneur. A lot of time, it could be just a particular activist who becomes a policy entrepreneur. A lot of times, policy entrepreneurs also come from the traditional governance system. Let's say you have a particular leader who's passionate about a particular policy and they implement it. So that's also not unusual. Okay. And the path of a policy entrepreneur, I don't think that we have a defined one as yet. We don't have, a research. I think policy entrepreneurship, that's, a great thing to research for upcoming researchers. Ferial?
So I just wanted to give an example of good policy entrepreneurship that's happening around the world. One is a gentleman called Joseph, working in India, actually, started in Chennai, and he started what we call neighborocracy, and it has children's parliaments, youth parliaments, and adult parliament. He wanted to be a politician, but realized it was going to corrupt him. So he moved away from that and started in his local neighborhood. He's now been doing it for 30 years, and he started 100,000 of these around India, and now moving into Europe and other places where we're hoping to implement it here too. So what's happened incredibly is because of how we are towards our children. So in other words, these bad faith actors you just spoke about a minute ago, they use a lot of times our own psychology, the way that we operate, the way, because we like these incentives, because we easily give up, because, you know, we got David and Goliath thing, all of that. So they use this against us to push their agendas, right? And so what Joseph did really, really well is the fact that we love our children. And so he focused in on the children's parliaments. And very often we do whatever it takes to give our children, you know, for them to be happy. So what he's done is he actually forms these children's parliaments where the children are a minister of finance, a minister of health, whatever they want to be ministers of, they are. And they're between the ages of 16 and 18. And these children actually make decisions because the children are not corrupted by their egos. They're not corrupted by financial gain. They're just making it for the good of their neighborhoods. So what they then do is they take whatever policy they come up with there, because they can't implement the policy, right? But they come up with it. So and it's just for their local, around them, their little village, their neighborhood. That's it.
So they give it to the local legislators, etc.
Exactly. And then they're almost shamed into responding. And actually, it's changed major laws for the people in India thus far already.
So this is a really new brand of policy thinking, which is called new public service. In fact, public policy, and I teach this in my comparative public administration course. That's a course that I developed at the San Francisco State University. I was teaching it over there. I also teach it at the GPODS fellowship, where there are three types of thinking about policy. The first is public administration, where somebody is an administrator and somebody is administered upon. So I'm like the ruler who's ruling over the others. You can't ask me, whether I'm doing good or bad. The second is new public management, which was like this more 1980s, Reagan Thatcher sort of a movement where the government, minimum government, and the government has no business to be in business, privatize, etc., etc. So that's about public management. There you're not administering upon the public, but you're like an expert who's managing the public. And there's a lot of critique of that as well, that a lot of times privatization has not led to efficiencies. It's led to oligopolies or monopolies being formed, etc., etc. So the new stuff which is coming up, and Denhart have done, Robert and I'm forgetting the other Denhart, they have done some amazing research on new public service, NPS, and that's about treating citizens and citizens. So you're steering your you're serving, you're not steering the boat. Okay, so the citizens are in the steering wheel, and you get the citizens to ideate about the policies, so co-create the policies, co-implement the policies, co-evaluate the policies. So that's the new public service mindset, and that's increasingly rising. So feel free to add me to LinkedIn and send me a link of this person's work in Tamil Nadu. Thank you, Ferial. Let me go to Myra and Shitisman, and then we move ahead.
Hello. Hi. So I have a question. Like in the initial, you mentioned that an example of trading of carbon credits between countries with less carbon emissions and those who produce more, like paying them off. But when we begin with the policy making process, the goal, the way it moves forward is being goal oriented. So in this case, wouldn't be the goal being compromised? Because when we look at policy making, we look at long-term benefits generally, because in policy making, it takes years to have the result in front of us. So wouldn't this be a compromise of the goal in essence?
Yeah, because the politics of it is influencing the policy. You don't want a clear winner and a clear loser. You want the most efficient compromise between the two parties. So for that particular brand of politics, you have the policy which is cap and trade. Does that make sense? So different sort of, if I want to pursue a politics where I'm saying that, okay, let the industries be shut down. Okay, or let me tax these industries, let me regulate them. Okay, so let them pay the majority of the cost because it's in the larger benefit of the people. Okay, great is good for the greatest numbers of sorts. Okay, so if I'm of that political bent of mind, then I'm going to, come up with regulative policies and not this sort of a compromise sort of a thing, as you mentioned, Myra. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me get to Shitisman.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Arpit. I have a question to ask. Like till now, what I have understood is the whole process of policy the whole process of policy making, as we have discussed right now, is more often falls under the liberal democracy side of understanding of a society.
Okay.
But how does that? No, how does so? This is actually, sorry to interrupt. So this is actually between two questions. So one is how policymaking process behave in a non-democratic society. So
Okay.
that would be taking the example of China or Russia. At the same time, when we discuss about the process of securitization, which is a process which is outside of political acts. So this is again part of political processes. So policy making within the political processes is well understandable and well described here. But my question is political processes when it is outside of policy processes outside of political space. So like securitized space where your normal political processes doesn't take place in the way like now we expect in Indian Parliament or so. But when it comes to securitized,
we are again talking about how does it happen in non-democracies.
And no, not even in democracies, when you go to securitizing side. So generally, the idea this was brought in by.
So let's say defense policy, etc., is it?
It can be a defense policy, but it can be a non-traditional security threat can also be put under securitization process.
Absolutely,
so in that,
absolutely. No, that's a good question, Shitisman, and I'm going to attempt to answer that. So number one is that whether it is a democracy or it is not a democracy, any policy will have winners and losers. Any policy will have costs and benefits on different stakeholders. And a lot of times these costs would be concentrated. A lot of times it'll be distributed. And similarly, the benefits concentrated and benefits distributed. So whether it's not as if, a dictatorship would not have any interest group politics or any entrepreneurial politics or any majoritarian politics. It could, even China would have, some bit of all four of these, because eventually, in a dictatorship, one person might be having a lot more of a say in how policies should be done. So that's about, who makes the decision. But this is really about who benefits and who pays the cost for the decision. And there are still costs and benefits from those policies. Okay. The second question that you asked me was about the securitization aspect of it. And even there, so even if it's a policy which is not being discussed in the parliament, if it is a policy where, let's say, a closed cabinet is just discussing on a particular thing, in that as well, there are going to be people who understands the costs and the benefits that a particular policy will incur, on the larger public. Okay, because eventually, let's say if you're trying to buy some secret weapons from a particular country, eventually you're going to be paying from the public budget. So, the costs are definitely, widely distributed, or a lot of times you might have a special fund. Okay, or a lot of times you might just tax or ask some of the big business persons in your particular country to finance that project. So then the costs become concentrated, and the benefits could also be likewise concentrated and distributed, either on a particular business house or on the public at large. One thing that I want you also to focus on is that this is not set in stone. What you see in front of you can change from the perspective that you're looking at. So think about it from the perspective of progressive taxation. Some might say that it's a redistributive policy because you take from one and you give to another. Another might say that it's a distributive policy. So let's say you're in a country where 90% of the people are poor and just 1% of them are paying taxes. Okay, so you take from, so you essentially are in a domain in that case where progressive taxation has a lot of concentrated costs, okay, but widely distributed benefits. Okay, so it becomes a regulative sort of a policy over there. If let's say only 1% of the population pays taxes or is eligible to pay taxes, okay, and the rest 99% they receive the benefits of those taxes, then it becomes a regulative policy. So it depends on context, it depends on the perspective from which you are looking at the stakeholders and you're looking at the concentration or distribution of their costs. Does that make sense, Shitizman?
I got, thank you.
Thank you. All right, perfect. So now how much time do we have? We have about 15 minutes. So I'm this bit is important, so I'm still going to cover it because this is going to be really, really useful to you. Okay, but please feel free to stop me if you think I'm running extremely quickly. Okay, so you must have seen, where's that? Okay, just give me a second, guys. Just give me a very quick second. I'm gonna put up another version of this slide. Stakeholder. There it is. Okay. Right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, now when we are dealing with all of these agendas, alternatives, policies, and the politics of it, how you manage stakeholders, that really is the name of the game. That's really, you know, when you get to the weeds, it's all about, you know, how you managing various stakeholders, whether it's about the problem stream or the policy stream or the politics stream. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen this stakeholder, mapping framework, which says that you have stakeholders who are either low on interest or high on interest. That's your x-axis over here. And then you have stakeholders who are low on power or high on power, and that's your y-axis over here. All right. Now, the theory says that, you know, people who are high interest and high power, you manage them closely. Okay, those are the stakeholders. If let's say you are pushing a particular policy agenda from that perspective. So from the perspective of policy entrepreneur, really. So you manage closely the stakeholders who are high on power and high on interest. Okay. You keep satisfied the stakeholders who are high on power and low on interest. Okay. You keep informed the stakeholders who are high on interest but low on power. And you simply just monitor and give minimum effort to stakeholders who are low on interest and low on power. Okay. So this is quite straightforward. But the question is, how do you figure out really whether a stakeholder is high interest or high power? Okay. And by the way, it's all dynamic. Typically, when you're a policy entrepreneur, you have to keep moving the stakeholders in different boxes as the situation unfolds. All right. So when we talk about the power of stakeholders, and this is Arun Agarwal and Jesse Ribot, where we talk about identifying stakeholders. And can I again request a few of us turn on our cameras? I get a little distracted if I don't see anybody with the camera on. Thanks, Sylvia. Thanks, Ipsa. All right. So this is how you figure out whether a stakeholder is high on power or low on power. Okay. And essentially what you need to do is that you need to figure out who are the actors, whether their accountability is up upwards accountability, they have to report to a senior within the bureaucracy or within the government system or within the legislature. So upwards accountability, that's easier to do. Downwards accountability means that you are accountable to the public directly. Okay, so if I'm an elected leader, I have a lot of downward accountability. A lot of times people would have both upward and downward accountability. Okay? And sometimes there's horizontal accountability, but we're not getting there. Let's just focus on upward and downward accountability. Okay. Then what you have is, what are the different types of powers that exist in a particular, in getting a particular policy passed. Okay. There are some people have the power to create rules. Okay. Some people have the power to implement compliance to those rules. Some people have the power. Okay. And some people have the power to adjudicate disputes. All right. It gives me a message that my internet connection is unstable. So let me just check. That's working fine. Seems it's working fine. Am I audible to you guys? Okay, cool. Thanks. All right. So what you have over here is, let's say if we were to do an example, and this is a particular example which is really India focused, but I'm going to try and make it as accessible to everybody as possible. So I map the actors and the powers and accountabilities like this. I would write down all of the who are involved, so all of the stakeholders who are involved, and I typically do it on an Excel sheet. Okay, and then if they have the power to create rules, I would give them a 1. If they don't have the power to create rules, I'd give them a 0. If they have the power to implement rules, I'd give them a 1. If they don't have it, then 0. To allocate resources, 1, otherwise a 0. To adjudicate disputes, if they have it, then 1, otherwise a 0. And if they can influence an actor, I'd give them 1 point each. Okay. And if they have upward accountability, I'll probably give them a 0. And if they have a downward accountability, I'll give them a -1. Okay, because downward accountability is harder a lot of times. But it's all context dependent. It's just I'm giving you frameworks how to exactly use it. In you might realize that downward accountability is actually an advantage, so give them a 1, because people eventually don't vote you out and so easily, because there are just so many of them. Okay, but it depends on context. But this is the framework, and what you can do is give them score on this. So let's say in India before COVID, every member of parliament had a certain amount of money allocated to their budget every year, so that they could develop their local constituency. Okay, so that was called the Local Area Development Fund for a parliamentarian. And I've mapped it over here, where a parliamentarian did not have the power to create rules on what projects can they spend this money on. Okay, because some projects are under the state government, some projects are under, others are under the local government. There are certain rules set by the parliament collectively, but not by an individual parliamentarian. So the parliamentarian individually create rules for their own constituency. So I give them a 0. I give them a no for this. Okay, I can convert it into numbers later on. Do they have the power to implement rules? They don't. Do they have the power to allocate resources? That's what the parliamentarian can do. That say that, okay, I'm going to allocate my kitty to development. So they have the power to allocate resources or to recommend where am I spend the resources. Okay, and they have no power to adjudicate disputes. Okay, who can they, as we call it in India. Okay, and the parliamentarian through rhetoric, etc., influence the public. Okay, so gets 2 points for that, and is downwards accountable to the public. nobody is really, keeping the parliamentarian accountable upwards. Okay. So I would, in this particular case, consider downward accountability as a negative thing, because if you're not spending it wisely, the public will boot you out. So I'm going to give the parliamentarian a -1 for this. Now, who has the power to create rules out of these? None of it. Neither the district court, nor the public, nor the local bureaucrat, nor the parliamentarian. To implement rules, that's the job of the local bureaucrat, that you will implement the rules. If they are not being implemented well, then it goes to the district court. So I give the district court half a point because they have some partial authority on it. The public doesn't have any power to do this. Okay, so a 0 on this. To allocate resources, yes, the parliamentarian has the power. The district magistrate can stop or allow the parliamentarian to allocate resources in certain projects. So I would give the district bureaucrat a 1 over here. Court can't do anything in this. Public can't do anything in this. Now, adjudicate disputes, only the court has the power to do that. Okay, and then I map who can influence whom, give the point on each, and then up over here. And when you calculate that, you would find a very neat relative positioning of how powerful is each of these entities. So when you're mapping them over here on whether somebody is high on power or low on power, this is the way to do it. All right. Now the question is, how do you define interest? How do I define whether somebody is high interest or low interest? Okay. That's the next problem that we have. Okay. Now, high interest and low interest, we define in this term. Just give me a second. We have already talked about it right here. Back to our Wilson-Lowy matrix. If for any particular stakeholder, costs are concentrated or benefits are concentrated, they are likely to be high interest. Okay. If I'm talking about farm laws and the costs are concentrated upon the farmer, then they are going to be high interest. And the benefits are concentrated upon the elderly population, then they're going to be. The others are not going to be. Not so much on high interest. Okay. So you understand how do you map people on power high to low, and how do you map people interest high to low? Okay. Now comes the last question, and after this I'm going to close it, which is that what do you do with these folks whom you have to manage? Because this is your most important group, right? And for this particular group, okay. Oh, I'm going in and out. Am I audible now? What was the part? What was the last thing that you heard? Or let me ask a more specific question. Do you understand how do you map people on the interest axis and the power axis? Or do you to repeat any bit of that? Okay, Ferial understands that. How do you map people on high interest or low interest? Okay, most of us. Perfect. Let me see. There's a question. Would accountability be the same as interest? No. So IPSA accountability, you remember we are mapping that on power. Upwards or downwards accountability. All right. Am I still coming in and out, or is this better right now?
Much better, Arpit. Now you may continue. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So the last bit, how do you manage people, like people who are high power and high interest? What do you do with them? Okay. And typically in that, you'd find people falling into these 4 categories. And this is some research work done by my professors at Cornell, Derek and Laura Cabrera, who are systems thinking researchers. And what they say is that they're eventually, and also think about the 3 phases of power that we discussed, but more towards this, that people who are really important, high interest and high power. You are going to have broadly 4 categories of them. In fact, these 4 categories would apply to all 4 of the boxes, people in all 4 of the boxes. But typically what we are most concerned with are people who are high interest, all right? And high interest and high power. So there are 4 types of people, okay? The first ones are your thought leaders, okay? They are the ones who completely understand your vision. They have completely bought into your vision. They believe in, all of the logics that you've presented in front of them, okay? And they add to it. They give you new ideas how to run this stuff, okay? These are your thought leaders. So you need them to drive the show. You need to love them. You need to give them a free hand, because a lot of times they're not in with you for some benefits. They are in with you because they are sold onto your idea, okay? So there's a value match with them. So let them come up with new ideas. Let them be the core group. Let them drive the process, okay? The next most important ones, or the next most positive ones, are the supporters, okay? So a lot of times people would support you because of a lot of positive or negative material or psychological interests, okay? And you need to reward them or recognize them, because if you don't reward them and recognize them, they're not in here only for your vision. They're also in here because your policy benefits them, okay? Either psychologically or materially. So you need to deliver on your policy, right? That's the idea over here. And you need to make sure that these folks, they get all of the right incentives, the right rewards. If you don't have material rewards, then psychological rewards, recognitions, etc., etc. That's what they get. The trickiest are fence sitters, okay? Imagine this is a fence and people are over here. What do you do with them? You do not give a positive or a negative incentive to a fence sitter. You don't punish them. You don't reward them. Because if you punish them, they're going to jump onto the other side from the fence, okay? They're probably going to be naysayers. They're quickly going to become naysayers. What you want is to show them party pictures. What you want is to give them a clear message that if you come onto this side, then you get a lot of rewards. It's amazing out here on the other side of the world, okay? Or on the other side of the fence. If you give them positive incentives, if you reward them, then they are more likely to remain fence sitters, because they're more likely to just stay put over there. FOMO, that's right. Get them over here. Don't reward them, otherwise they're reaping rewards for just sitting on the fence. But a lot of times what happens is that, for a person who's a fence sitter, who's not really sure about your agenda, your cause, we tend to get frustrated and we abuse them, or we, confront them with a lot of aggression. And instead of educating them and, gradually bringing them to this side and by showing them the party pictures, etc., you are alienating them and you are making it attractive. You're pushing them to the other side, and that's how a lot of times we talk about the radical right movements creeping up in the world. A lot of times what's happened is that the radical left has pushed people onto the other side so much, rather than showing them the party pictures and bringing them over here, right? So the fence sitters are really most important, because they are the critical mass. If a lot of them just move over to your side, then you have a graph that looks somewhat like this instead of looking like this, okay? And this is the push that you're looking at. You need majority of the people to be over here, okay? And naysayers, a lot of time you ignore them. Some people argue that it's also fine to compete, punish, etc., etc. But then we get into game theory, and that's again, in part of my 20-hour lecture series, then I go into what strategies do you adopt with naysayers, etc., etc. It's not always brute aggression that works. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. It's a combination of that. Okay, so but this is overall, what we have covered is how And, I've really designed it from the perspective of a policy entrepreneur who wants to get some particular policy agenda or policy passed, okay? Whether in a legislature or in general, or just get the legislature to do it. You don't have to be, a member of a legislature. And what we have covered so far is a realistic understanding of how policies, convert into real action on the ground. B, an understanding of, what are the various types of policies that exist and what sort of politics ensue from these policies and vice versa. Then, how do you manage stakeholders? How do you figure out who is high power, who's low power, who's high interest, who's low interest? And then for people who are high interest and high power, how do you manage them? So that's broadly been the structure of today's workshop. Let me invite Sylvia for her question or comment. Over to you, Sylvia.
Hi, thank you for having me. I absolutely loved it until now. However, everything that you've presented until now, it's a very rational system, which I love because we need this kind of strategy when we create policy. However, what I haven't heard until now, and maybe that's why the fence sitters might be, rather than being, given incentives in terms of how they can benefit, maybe it would be about adding value, adding honor into the equation. A lot of people do not go with certain policies, do not support them because there is no human value, there is no verticality, no spine. People nowadays and leaders within present times, contemporary times, we need to be a bit more wholesome, a bit more orientated towards human values and towards their psyche. It's not just the benefits, the ratio of benefits and interests and the power. A lot of the power comes from, like Ferial said, when people unite. How can we unite people? Through values, through acceptance, tolerance. So maybe a bit of an agenda when we create policies will have to do with the human psyche rather than just the rationality of it. And I think maybe that would be an interesting aspect to see how future leaders could incorporate that into policy making. Otherwise, they're soulless.
I absolutely agree with you. And, I was talking to a friend who's an economist, and we both agreed that psychology eats economics for breakfast. If we don't understand psychology really well and just, rely on economic tools to make policy, those are bound to fail. And, what you're talking about values, that's certainly, the flip argument also works. What if somebody who's a fence sitter or who's a naysayer, but let's say a fence sitter who's under the spell of the third phase of power, where, their value system has been molded in a manner where these party pictures look like hell to that person. Okay. These party pictures are not just valued by that person. What you'll have to do is look into the mind of this person, and these party pictures need not be real incentives. These party pictures could also be, as you said, just the sheer recognition of respect. That's a psychological benefit at the end of the day, right? To feel accepted. So it has to be absolutely not the very linear. And in fact, in our fellowship, we offer a systems thinking workshop where we talk about the fact that, the way that policies turn out or the outcomes of the policies turn out, it's never linear. It could have so many different layers to it, so many positive and negative externalities to it. So how do you cut through that complexity and look at the underlying rules that make the system tick? It's extremely, and just one last bit before I come to Ferial and Ishwarya. I was talking to some politicians over here in India, and I was telling them, in fact, I'm planning to write an article on this. If I have the time, then maybe a book, which would be my second book, which is that I feel that there are three thinkings about political science. The first generation of politicians used to think that you need to be accessible, you need to just meet a lot of people and you'll win your elections. Okay. So that's the interaction-based mindset. The second mindset was interest-based mindset, which we were just critiquing over here, Sylvia, that who can do the most for the right combination of people, and they get the majority of the vote and they win. Okay, so who can deliver the greatest goods for the right majority of the people. That's interest-based politicians, and they would talk about how many people their policies have benefited, what has been the economic growth, etc., etc. Okay, that's interest-based politics. The third phase in which we are in now is identity-based politics or value-based politics, where if there's a value match, if let's say Ferial and I are contesting elections and you are the voter, Sylvia, then maybe I will tell you that, okay, if you vote me in, I'm going to give you $1,000 every month extra. Okay, so I'm talking about interest group politics, but identity politics will defeat me, because if Ferial tells you, that, hey, I will also give you $1,000 a month, but in addition to that, let's say I also belong to the same tribe as you, or we have an identity match. Maybe we belong to the same gender, or we belong to the same place. So I'm part of your in-group psychologically. I'm also giving you the same benefits. Then you're probably going to vote for Ferial and not for me. Okay. Or the other way that Ferial could do is Ferial could say that, what Arpit is giving you, that $1,000, it's actually not for your benefit. So she's then going to apply the third phase of power on you. Okay.
So I'm going to graduate as an animal scientist this year. I'm studying with another friend of mine, Rosie. Thank you. We are actually animal behavior, welfare, and conservation students. So one of my main priorities is animal policies and legislations. And for my dissertation, I'm trying to see whether there would be academically purely any kind of support for animal rights legislation. So for legal identity and legal protection for animals. And this is where I think is extremely important, instead of not necessarily to identify with the people, but I think it has to be a dialogue, because when it comes to rights for minorities, people always feel that rights are like pie. If you give some more rights, then automatically some rights will be taken away from them.
They're thinking in redistributive policy terms.
Exactly. So I think this is where we need to first start really working hard. So we're seeing how we can break these glass ceilings and how we can portray a more egalitarian society where life actually does matter regardless.
So a great, two great examples of this. One is Animals Asia, Jill Robinson, who's been able to, not eradicate, but substantially impact beer bile farming in China, Vietnam, etc. And Jill is coming in as a mentor in the next cohort. So if you apply, you're going to be talking to Jill about it. I'm sure she's going to be super interested in what you're saying. And similarly, Valentina Dotto, who's also a mentor, she's done similar work. Her PhD topic has been on, can you give environmental entities, rivers, etc., a right? Okay. So you can do that. I want to be cognitive of the, aware of the time. So, okay, we are already 11 minutes over. So I'll spend 4 more minutes and just answer all of the rest of the questions. So quickly over to you, Ferial, then Aishwarya and Edgar.
Well, I just want to make an observation here. I work in whole system change, so rapid whole system change, right? So some of the thinking that we have here, or that we've discovered, mining the experiences and work of so many others, right? So this is not really just my own thoughts, but the fact that you see the external, so what you're talking about when you're talking about policy, all these kind of things, like community development, all those, this is the external transformations that we're talking about, the external developments. But we've realized that these things fall absolutely flat onto the ground, and speaks into what Sylvia's just said, when it is not coupled with internal development, internal transformation. Because as a society, when we now are these politicians, or when we even pick our politicians, we pick them based on very little information.
Isn't Afghanistan a great example of it today? what you're
because
saying.
Right? Because we give them the authority and we don't want to take responsibility. We don't want to do self-governance. So that is why we land up where we are. But if we invest in our own internal selves, if we're looking at what is good for society, and then the other part of it is when I understand that I'm not just individual, because when I'm just seeing individual, I'm going to make choices, decisions, everything based on the individual, but I am very much collective, which means my decision making and how I choose my politician, what I eat, what I do, everything I then do is for the benefit of both myself and both.
So that's why informing yourself about how to be a good citizen and practicing it, it is considered a noble vocation. And, right from the times of the Greeks, it has been held as a huge virtue to inform yourself and learn about citizenship as a concept. And that's why I support, the new public service, citizens as co-creators and co-implementers and co-evaluators of policy. I absolutely, In fact, in my comparative public administration course, the last exercise that we have is that we figure out what circumstances what combinations of circumstances lead to effective public participation, and when you take out some of those circumstances, you don't have it. There are different pathways. But thank you so much. I absolutely agree that it starts from your internal value structure, and that's what defines your behavior eventually. And at a larger level, that defines the society's behavior. So thank you, Ishwarya, and then Edgar.
Okay, so hi. Actually, what I'm recently observing is power, regardless of how much we discuss the individual human rights and human rights oriented policies. So what I want to know is, regardless of a merit in a policy that we propose, we need political will to, actually bring these policies into effect. So how exactly are we going to achieve this, political will when the politicians themselves defend whatever policies they made, as they have their own ideologies and sometimes even tend to incline towards authoritarianism, even though they belong to a democracy.
So, to deal with political will, there are different ways of doing this. You need to, check out this think tank called Narrative Strategies. They're also one of our mentors over here, GPODS, where they talk about how do you define a narrative, how do you come up with a narrative, and how do you just, influence people and capture them in a particular narrative. A lot of times, you can gain a lot of power just through getting the right narratives out. Okay, and they say that counter narratives don't work very well. Narrative doesn't have to be true or false. Even if false narratives are propagated by some bad actors, they'll still catch some space. And counter narratives don't work very well. What works well is a new narrative which gives you a new vision of the world. So if I'm just saying that, Ishwarya's policies are terrible, they are bad, etc., it's not going to work. I have to tell you about a new sort of a world. I have to give you a new vision. Okay. And narratives are pretty linear, that X happened, therefore Y happened, therefore Z happened, therefore we failed. Or X, Y, Z happened and therefore we passed. Okay? And now figure out your vision, your mission, your capacity systems, and how you will have to wield the longest. He just having a narrative where he has
Arpit, I think you'd like to go again because
okay. Sure. I'm just closing on this. Ishwarya, that's a long discussion, but I'll send you some material on it. Okay. Let me bring Edgar finally, and then I hand it over to Isha.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was actually going to ask regarding the narrative stuff, because as of now, we see that digitalization has been so much of influence, since we were talking about influence previously. on creating narratives that shape the reality. I mean, like, so in that manner, there is a saying like this: "He who controls the narrative shapes the reality." So that's something that I wanted to ask. So yeah.
Absolutely. And there's this whole body of scientific research on how narratives are created, how they're diffused, how they're propagated, etc., etc. It was originally in the realm of military intelligence. Then it's been used for elections as well. So there's whole body of research, but happy to take it up sometime later. If you're part of the fellowship, then we will have a lot of time to discuss it. But meanwhile, thank you so much for attending. It has been an absolute pleasure. This is the sort of audience that we want to talk to all the time. So you've been phenomenal, and I hand it over to Ishan now.
All right, great. I have been observing, and it's a very, very tough act to follow. I'm just thinking if I should make it a one-session workshop and end it here on a high note, because it can only go downhill from here. But thank you. The engagement has been pretty awesome. So we're going to play a short video, a 2-minute video that will also give you a break between my session and Arpit's. And right after the 2-minute video, we'll move on to my session where we'll be discussing SDGs and IR. All right, so without any further ado, if we could play the video, please.
GPODS has helped us build such a rich network of professionals who are truly global, and then to be able to have such dynamic conversations and learn so much from my peers and be pushed to think about policy and the environment and sustainability in such different ways has been such a gift.
Yeah, come from a totally quantitative background, and this program has given my mind some great wings because I've met mentors from different walks of life and transcending many different avenues of human empathy.
All right. I hope that gave you some time to breathe because we had straight away going to dive into something absolutely different from what Arpit was discussing. As I said, I have done these workshops, but today's session was incredible. So yeah, I start with a bit of pressure on myself to deliver something that could be matching to what Arpit said. So anyway, let me just, do you guys see the SDGs and IR slide deck? All right, great. So by way of introduction, all of you, first of all, welcome. I hope the last couple of hours have been nice. By way of introduction, I am an environmental lawyer and I hold a master's in environmental law and policy with a major in climate change policy from Stanford Law. I have worked with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNHQ, and I'm also the Assistant Dean of a Sustainability School in India, where we teach undergrad, grad courses. But my area of interest is international environmental governance systems. And the more I read up on it, the more confused I get because there are so many actors that are at play every time SDGs and international relations are discussed. So I also have a different slide deck prepared where we could get into how unintended consequences of policy can have environmental impacts. But I'm going to save it for later in case there are any questions on that issue. I'll be happy to take off one of those ideas. Anyway, so to start us off, let me give you the current setting of international relations and environment. every COP, every conference of parties, every international diplomatic discussion on environment, on climate change, starts and stops with global south, global north, right? Why is the other person doing so much? Why am I doing so much? Why is the other person doing so little? Where am I getting the finances from? Where am I getting the technology from? You know, that's the conversation that happens whenever it comes down to environment in international relations, in all of diplomatic circles. And that's what our current multilateral agreement system is based on. So everyone is a part of it. To put it in context, let me talk about the context of a random line that I could have drawn on this screen. One second, I don't know why it's not showing. Anyway, so let me just move on. If I had put a line across the screen and I had asked all of you to tell me what this line is, let me just see if I can find it. One second, hold on. All right, yeah, got it. So as I was saying, context is very, very important whenever we're trying to understand what environment is, what climate change is, and how it plays out at the diplomatic level. Now, if this was a random thing on your screen, and if I were to ask you what this is, what would you say it is? So there's some scribbling on your screen. If I were to ask you, you might say that, you know, this is a line that connects point A to point B. You might say that this is a direction that points to the right on your screen. You might say that it's a travel path from the west to the east. You know, it could be so many things depending on what your context is, what your understanding of society, what your understanding of everything that has brought you to be the person you are today. That is, and that's the whole point of context. And that's how climate change, climate action, international relations, everything. We have a cheeky comment saying this is the declining status of environment as well. That could very well be what you consider it to be. Exactly my point. But let's move to the basics of where this whole divide and how did we get where we are today in the international relations of environment. So for those of you who do not know, that was my very, very bad attempt at drawing what we understand as the brand line. All right. So what you see on your screens is a map that has been divided into two halves, right? The top half is called the global north and the bottom half is called the global south. Now, obviously, there are exceptions in this global north and global south debate. You can see the line takes an absolute south dive and includes Australia and New Zealand within the global north. But this is where the whole conversation on global north and global south comes from. Okay. Now, what does this mean? What does this imaginary line that does not exist, and God knows we have enough imaginary lines that shouldn't exist in the first place, but what does this imaginary line do? It basically divides our world into what we consider to be the developing world and what we consider to be the developed world. And we'll go into how that plays such a major role in designing problems, in redefining psyches of how we look at the world. Because according to this line, everything above this line has capacity, but also has culpability to lead our environment to where it is today. And that's a problem. That's problematic because as soon as you assign culpability and capacity on the basis of an imaginary line that you've drawn across the world map, it's obviously going to lead to a lot of issues. But this is what happened, and the brand line came into existence. It divided the world into the developed countries and the developing countries, the global north and global south as we know it. And this was supposed to signify not what or who has a higher carbon footprint. That's not what this line was about. It was about who's rich and who's poor, right? Simplicity. So the rich countries fall above the line, the poor countries fall below the line, and then derivatives from this line were derived. So the global north, global south, higher carbon footprint, lesser carbon footprint, less per capita, high per capita, and such. So what really is the global north and global south? What really is the conversation that always happens whenever it comes to environment or climate change? Grantline developed on the basis of an imaginary divide between our world, split into relatively richer and poorer nations. Richer countries were all located in the northern hemisphere. Obviously, certain exceptions existed, and similarly, poorer countries were mostly located in the tropical regions and in the southern hemisphere. Again, exceptions exist. And you can think of exceptions if you think about it. So countries such as Argentina, Malaysia, Botswana, all have a very high GDP compared to other countries, but still appear in the global south. So the next time we use the word global south loosely, we should remember that there are enough countries that should be in the global north, but just are geographically inconvenient to fit into that division that we've created. And secondly, you have a country like Ukraine that has a poor set of definitives on which you could define certain attributes that makes it a rich or a poor country, and it appears in the global north, right? So first of all, the first thing that we need to realize is that do not use the word global north and global south loosely, because it does not really define a set of well-defined definitives, as I call them. It does not really have X, Y, and Z falling in the global north and X, Y, Z falling in the global south. That's not what it is. But this conversation actually takes a very, very steep downturn when you think about the implications of the global north and global south divide. So you have an issue with inflation of inequality within the countries. We have seen, if you take the US, for example, there is the Fresno County, when there are other pockets of poorer communities within the global north itself. So is it okay to paint it all with the same brush of global north, global south, rich, poor, higher carbon footprint, lower carbon footprint? And there are also significantly rich pockets in the global south. So you look at parts of South Africa, China, India, Indonesia, and a bunch of other countries in South America. You look at Brazil and you look at even parts of Mexico and Peru, you'll find a lot of rich communities and pockets which could not otherwise have been defined as the global south if it wasn't for an imaginary line that was convenient for humankind. So the question is, why do you have these inequalities? Why do you have these inequalities within and externally? And the first point that I've laid out, availability of natural resources, is going to be a lot of is central to our today's discussion. And I promise I'm not going to go overboard. I will finish this in the next 60 minutes. So all of you can have your coffees and dinners and breakfast and wherever you're joining us from. But the inequalities stem from some inherent factors and some external factors. And these are very, very important because we're going to pick up from Arpit's point of governance and lend it to this idea of inequality as well, of the global south and global north. But I think all of us intuitively would say that a country is rich or a country is poor, owing a lot to the kind of natural resources it has been bestowed with, right? So if you have enough natural resources, that means that you're importing less, you're exporting more, your deficit is less, you have more natural resources, which leads to more education, innovation, higher per capita, all of those things. Now, apart from that one issue, almost all of the issues, in fact, 4 or 5 of the issues that follow are issues about what you do with these natural resources, how you manage everything around these natural resources. So what is the kind of education and health that the governance provide, right? The nature of country's economy and its industrial sectors governed by the government of that country. International trading policies and access to markets that the governance allows you to govern. International relationships between countries. Some countries are known to be historically very astute when it comes to their diplomacy. Conflict within and between countries, again, a human-based governance issue. And finally, as to cap off the natural resources bit, the country's vulnerability to natural hazards and climate change. So certain countries, certain pockets of the world are, for example, more prone to earthquakes, right? And that cannot be faulted on them. That's where they're based, that's the geographical location, that's the environmental situation of that one country. All right. So, right, okay. I keep digressing and keep checking the comments every now and then. All right, so natural resources then plays a very, very important role in defining whether you're a rich country or a poor country, and hence all the conversations and diplomatic relations that you follow. So let's look at this very, very important concept that very few of us know about, and if we do know about it, we probably do not think about it as much. The resource curse talks about a concept where it presupposes that if you have natural resources or abundant natural resources as a country, then your economy is doomed to fail, right? So it's counterintuitive to everything that we understand. So if you're rich in natural resources, you should be a rich country, but that's not how it works out. And that's what's surmised under the concept of resource curse. And think about it. Think about the countries that are very rich in oil, that are not as rich in oil, but doing very well for themselves. There are enough examples of the resource curse playing out in real life. So the resource curse conceptually says that possession of natural resources is neither necessary nor sufficient to confer economic success. In fact, it goes the other way. If you have natural resources, you'll probably not be economically successful. And we'll get into the idea of why that is. And at the GPODS Fellowship, we have a whole course structured around this. So I'm happy to address more questions about the fellowship and how we conduct the courses later. Now, they talk about many of the countries in Africa and the Middle East, right? Countries that are very rich in oil, in gas, in coal, in other non-renewable fossil fuel-based energy resources. And think about those countries and how their economies are doing. Now, again, I'll put a rider here. There are exceptions to the whole conversation of resource curse. And you'll find enough exceptions in each of these pockets that we're discussing. But many countries in Africa and the Middle East are rich in oil and other natural resources, and yet their people continue to experience low per capita income and a low standard of life, right? So the kind of opportunities that are available, infrastructure that is available, that might be almost counterintuitive, right? Exactly. Nigeria is a wonderful example, so rich in natural resources, so rich in biodiversity, and yet its economy could be doing a lot better if you compare it with countries that have lesser resources, right? Now, this puzzling phenomena is what we call the resource curse. When you have all the resources in the world, but your economy does not show it. And it almost holistically and specifically focuses on non-renewable natural resources. So we're looking majorly at fossil fuel-based resources. That's why I'm not saying that I'm talking about specifically about water resources. I'm specifically talking about biodiversity or endangered species. I'm specifically talking about, and resource curse specifically talks about fossil fuel-based resources, non-renewable based resources. And it makes sense because, you know, fossil fuel-based resources usually translate into money. It translates into export, import, energy security, and so many other things. But resource curse plays out in real life. Now, let us look at Angola, Congo, Nigeria, Venezuela as examples, and there are many others that I haven't put in the picture. I'm sure you can think of many. All of these, yes, exactly, Hafsa. Venezuela is an absolute example, and so is Congo. So I feel like either you guys have already watched this lecture because you're already guessing the examples that I'm taking, or you guys are very, very smart. But either way, there are enough examples of countries that have an abundance of natural resources and not the kind of economic might that you'd expect. And this is where it starts getting tricky, because most literature only attempts to explain how there are these countries, exactly what I did here in my last slide, that listen, these are countries that are rich in abundant fossil fuel-based resources, and look how their economies are not doing as well as they should be doing. But there is, and thereby lies the story, and there is the gap in our understanding. Many resource-cursed states experience failure in development instead of arguing that states rich in natural resources would be better off without them. This is the whole surmise of resource curse. Now, this is where the whole concept started happening. The Dutch disease is the concept that basically observed that there was a natural resource revenue boom in the Netherlands. I think this was around the 80s. And around that time, because there was this increase in natural resource revenue, you suddenly have prices of goods being higher, people willing to spend more, people being able to afford more. And suddenly you saw all of these things happening at the same time, which led to a general price rise, a general rise in standard of living, people wanting to spend more on the quality of their life and such. But eventually what happens is either you run out of natural resources or there's another supplier in town, which means that there are other countries that are selling cheaper, better quality, or just better transportation-wise easily available natural resources or fossil fuels, right? And in that case, what happens is that the economy by then has turned into this beast that only caters to high-end products. The prices are high, the costs are high, the value you derive from the products are high, but the revenue has reduced. And when this revenue reduces, and you're still willing to pay more and you're used to better products and better quality and better quantity, there is a lull in the economy. So inflation and real exchange rate appreciation leads to price of natural, led by price of natural resource commodities increases, exports become expensive relative to world market prices, and so on and so forth. And eventually there's a decrease in your demand, as I was saying, because either you yourself are not giving the kind of quality that others are offering, or your price is too competitive or not too competitive, and suppliers of non-resource goods produce less, reduction in the income and employment of non-resource industries, and so forth. So eventually you see a lull in the market, and your country, your economy is already used to paying higher prices or used to having a certain quality of products that they can no longer afford. And this was coined as the Dutch disease. Now, natural resource sector pulls in domestic resources, as you can see, increases the price of domestic resources in the domestic market because the people have more power to pay now, and increases the production costs of other sectors. As soon as these costs are increased, you go into that spiral of having to pay more, claiming more, not having the money, and that leads to an economic downturn. And this was the pulling effect. This was called the spending effect and pulling effect when you put together. Now, this is just to show you this evolution of how things have happened. So ideally, eventually, at the beginning of this whole thing, not eventually, we saw that natural resources were considered very important for economies. Then there was the emergence of the Dutch disease theory. Then there was the resource curse theory that came about that absolutely changed the way we look at things. It was coined. There was empirical evidence that confirmed the adverse effects of resource dependence. And there was a link that was established between natural resource dependence and factors that can drive economic growth. Now, there are also critiques to this theory, and that's where it gets very, very interesting. But to give you an example, in case you're still wondering, this is the graph that shows average economic growth rate in terms of percentage and the kind of natural resources or fossil fuel-based resources, to be exact, that exist in a country. Okay, so you have countries like Saudi Arabia, which is an exception in terms of economic growth and the kind of fossil fuels that are available, but follow this line. And below this line is where you'll find a majority of economies that have a reasonable amount of natural resources, but not the kind of economic growth rate that you'd expect. So why does this happen? And this is where it gets very interesting. This is where the governance of it that I was mentioning earlier comes into the picture. Typically, let's say that you lend me money, right? I'm your friend and you lend me money. And I say that, listen, I have to use this for your own betterment. So give me money and you give me the money and I make sure that I use it for your betterment. But what if I did not use it for your betterment? What if I went for a night out and spent all of the money? You would be concerned, right? You'd suddenly be more concerned about where your money went. Why hasn't it come as a benefit to you? Think of the society that you live in. Think of the colony that you live in. Think of your building or wherever you're joining us from. If your Residents Welfare Association, the group of residents in your community, says that, listen, we need a better street that connects our society or our colony to the main part of town, and let's all pool in money and build a new street that connects us to the town. All of you will pool in the money, and then all of you will be interested in what has been done with that money. Where have we constructed the street? Is it good? Is it not? Does it have speed breakers? Does it have speed bumps? Does it have traffic lights? Does it have stop signs? Does it have crossing ways and zebra crossings for children and elderly and schools and all of those things, right? So you're invested when you are paying the money for that resident welfare association. And typically, countries that have no resources do this by way of tax, right? So we are going to tax you, and we're going to, from your taxes, give you better health infrastructure, better physical infrastructure, better roadways, better airports, railways, whatever you might have, right? Now, if these things do not come about, you then go into the country, you go into the government saying, I gave you this money, but I don't see that expenditure, or I don't see it being used to its optimum quality, right? So citizens have more basis for scrutiny on this public expenditure if there are taxes involved. Now think of resource-rich countries. They don't need to tax as much. Those governments, those countries, those nation states are earning their money from lending, leasing out their fossil fuel resources. So in case anyone has doubts, typically there are mining leases that are entered into. So the government or the country itself, the state, leases that mine to a private sector company. The private sector company pays rent, basically, and I'm oversimplifying here, pays rent, basically, and then the country earns money through this leasing, through exploiting its own natural resources. Okay, and there's this whole concept of eminent domain and such, which we're not getting into. Now, because I'm getting a large chunk of my money from leasing my own resources, I do not have to tax at all, or not to the same extent that I would have taxed my citizens had we not had any natural resources. So you'll see most of the countries with the highest level of taxation rates would be the ones that have the least amount of resources, right? Mostly. And there are exceptions to everything that I'm saying here. And similarly, because these countries are resource rich, most of the money comes from natural resources, fossil fuel-based resources. The citizens are not as invested because it's then not the money that's going out of their own pockets, right? So you are not paying the government $1. It's the government funding itself, right? And because your money is not directly invested and you are not directly invested by correlation, there would not be as much scrutiny on what the government does with that money, right? Now, there's another soft element to all of this, which is when there is a lot of economic opportunity for the government and the government itself is in the business of business, that leads to corruption, that leads to black markets, that leads to red tape and a bunch of other things, as a lot of us would already know. So who's governing the ones who are governing us? That's the question that usually arises when there is zero or very less accountability on the government being in the business of business. Okay. So that's where we're at on how these things happen. Now, typically resource-rich countries, and this is the major criticism, and there are examples of this, with good institutions, good democratic institutions that look after their expenditure, that do auditing of their expenditure, trade openness and high investments in exploration technology seem to enjoy the fruits of their natural resource wealth. And I just want to preface everything that I'm saying by mentioning that all of these things that are things that you have observed in your surroundings, in your academic life or professional life. It's just that sometimes these connections are too different and distinct to draw them. But resource curses, major criticism is that if you have that human element, the governance element, well defined, then the resource curse must not always kick in. Okay. And that is derived from ambition and execution of institutions. Now, there could be public institutions and there could be private institutions. We will be getting into private institutions per se. But this is how institutions and the kind of dichotomy that arises between these institutions because of their governance structures and the efficacy of those governance structures. All right, I'm being pinged about the time. Apparently, Arpit went overboard. Now I have to cut down my time. So I'll be very quick with this. The larger question is, if you run your own business, all right, and we're going into the concept of institutions and private institutions when it comes to SDGs. If you run your own business, will you pay an extra $1 to have an eco-friendly product? And if you tell me yes, or if you tell me no, both the answers would be wrong. Because if you run your own business and if you're wondering whether I should pay that extra $1 to have more eco-friendly products in my supply chain, my retail business, whatever it may be, it is not your decision. The decision on whether you're willing to manufacture more eco-friendly products by spending that much more, that answer is given by the consumers, right? The people who buy your products, the people who take your services. And that's why all of the discussions on private sector SDGs come down to what's happening on the demand side and not as much on the supply side. That is not to say supply side does not have a footprint. For the supply side has an incredible amount of footprint, but demand side really governs how much you're willing to go eco-friendly. All right. So before I move into this subject, and maybe I'll leave it after a more theoretical discussion for all of you to check out the GPODS fellowship and we can have a larger discussion there. I have a couple of bones to pick with the concept of sustainable development. And if you look at the history of sustainable development, it came out in a world-winding way and everyone was convinced by this theory. Everyone believed in the concept of sustainable development. If you do not believe in the concept of sustainable, that's the extent that it has gone to. But let's look at the definition of this concept that we've fed every day of our lives. Sustainable development is defined as the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their needs, right? So we're not compromising on what's happening today and not compromising on what the future generations might have for themselves. And the first thought that occurs to me when I read this definition, and it's done a tremendous job in the global academic affair scenario, where it has got sustainable development front and center in all of our minds and all of our discussions. But is there something that stands out in this definition for all of you? The first thing is to get all of the countries of the world to agree to a particular, I'm looking at the comments, very interesting. One thing is that almost all the countries have to come together and agree to a particular definition, which means that we cannot have a very, very strongly worded definition in the first place, right? You have to give scope for flexibility in the definition itself. So the first thing you notice, as has been noticed in the chat as well, is that there is a certain level of ambiguity in the concept of sustainable development. So what are the needs? How do you define needs? How do you define the present? How do you define the ability of the future generations, right? All of these are questions that you could answer according to yourself. You could, if I were to put you in the shoes of a lawyer, you could argue from both the sides, from the side of someone who has a very high carbon footprint and someone who has a very low carbon footprint. So the first thing to notice is that the definition of the concept of sustainable development, very rightly so, because you require the strength of 192 countries to agree to something, is decently ambiguous. There are a couple of other things that I'd like to touch upon before we move into the corporate side of sustainable development. And these are the 4 questions that I put to you, and I'm not expecting answers to all of this. You could think about it, and I'm happy to have a chat on each of these things if you're so interested. I'll put down my email ID in a bit, and we could have a conversation if need be. The first question, when you're dealing with this definition of sustainable development, the development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising on the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. The first question is, what is the quantum, right? How much do you leave behind? Is it need-based, right? So why should I only allow for the future generations to meet their needs when I did not have to restrict my life standards only to needs, right? If I could afford, I had luxuries. If I could afford, I had wants. If I could afford, I had desires. I had all of these things. But why should the future generations only restrict themselves to needs? So what is the quantum? What is the metrics that you leave behind? Is it need-based? Is it luxury-based? Is it desire-based? Is it want-based? But more importantly, what do you leave behind? Because the definition does not talk about the currency, right? It does not say that you have to leave an X amount of GDP behind, or a Y amount of life expectancy behind, or general health behind, or natural resources behind. So and something that we cover in the GPODS fellowship is the concept of ecosystem services. And under the concept of ecosystem services, one sort of service which can be valued in terms of the economic gains that brings is called the cultural service. Now, cultural service, as an example, this is 1995, you're with your family, you're a kid, and you have gone on a picnic or a mountain retreat with your family, right? And the drive that you took to that spot is one of the most scenic drives that you've seen ever. Now, according to the cultural service aspect of ecosystem services, that cultural service that was provided by that drive that you took to that picnic spot or the hill or the mountain or the beach, that has an incredible amount of ecosystem service that was paid to you in terms of value of that drive. So my larger question that I was asking all of you is, what will be the currency? How do you leave that drive behind for future generations? How do you make sure that that drive still has scenery, snow-capped mountains, a wonderful hill that it swirls around? How do you know that hill will still survive and not be mined completely for sand and stone and silica, right? So what is the currency? So we asked, what is the quantity, need, luxury, want, and what is the currency? GDP, natural resources, cultural services, so many other things that it could be. Now the third question, and we'll sort of touch upon this a little later in the session if we have the time. It's what I call the pizza conundrum. Okay. Now the pizza conundrum is such. You have gone out with your friends and you have invited all of them over for dinner. All right. And you come back home and your partner asks you, or your family asks you, so you have planned dinner for us. What do you have in mind? And you say, I'm going to order pizzas. If you could do it for me, we're going to offer pizzas for dinner. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that logical argument. So you want to order pizzas for the people you've invited over for dinner. Now, the obvious question that this partner of yours will ask you is, all right, how many pizzas do you want me to order? Okay. And for that answer, you need to know how many people you have invited over for dinner, right? Because you cannot guess the number of pizzas you want to order unless you know the number of people you're having over. So the third question then is, what is the future generation? How much is the future generation? And sometimes we overlook the population element to the whole sustainable development game, right? So the question then is, in your risk and population modeling assessments, how many people do you have figured to leave enough need-based, luxury-based, desire-based currency of resources behind? If there are 30 folks you've invited over for dinner, you have to order pizzas accordingly, right? So how do you get on to an answer that gives you an idea of how much of these resources that we speak of in sustainable development do we have to leave behind? And there are ways to do this. You can have a population policy. Some of the countries in the past have had a population policy. You might restrict it to a one-child policy if you so wish. So the whole globe can only have one child per person, per couple, however you wish to streamline that policy. Now, there are issues with that policy. In the past, we have noticed that whenever one-child policies are involved, it gives rise to disastrous consequences. So, in the past, you've seen that in rural communities, especially around the globe, those regions that have had a one-child policy, you've noticed that parents prefer, unfortunately, and this is why I said that this is the tragedy in itself, prefer a male child, right? So when you have a one-child policy, unless you're educating people enough, there will be a dip in the sex ratio and obviously will lead to a lot of illegal actions which should not be permitted in the first place. It has also given rise in the past to black markets of human trafficking. Because you're only allowed one child, what if you have a second? And that leads to an incredible amount of policy issues altogether, right? So the one issue that one way out of this was having a certain number of children by way of policy and nothing more and nothing less. And then by that logic, you know what the population is going to be, and hence you can provide enough resources to that whole population of the future. But as I told you, it's not practical to have a one-child or two-child or three-child policy, which means we left with the infinite children policy. Now, the infinite children conundrum, as was proposed by Dr. Amartya Sen, or at least he touched upon it, was basically that you can have as many children as you want. Now, when we have that policy, which is what we have currently in most of almost of the planet, you can never put a number to how many folks you have 10 years later, 15 years later, 20 years later, and all of our population modeling schemes can only be so exact. Because what if, as we've seen in the past, there is a pandemic, right? Or what if there's something, a technology that comes by which leads to an absolute disruption of our population climate models, right? And so that third question itself is a very tricky one. How many pizzas do you order? Now, the fourth question, which ethically is probably the most important question of them all, is who gave us the right to decide all of these things for the future generation, right? So who gave us the right to play God? Who gave us the right to decide that, all right, it's going to be need-based for the future generations, and all right, this is going to be the currency, and all right, this will be the population, right? No one decided it for us. So who gave us the right to decide all of these factors for the sustenance of humankind? And why do we get to play God, right? And those are the four qualitative fallacies that are inherent to the concept of sustainable development that we do not think through as often when we talk about the concept. Now, very quickly, and I'm conscious of the time, I'll probably take another 10 minutes and give you a snippet, a bit of a tease of what we do at the GPODS Fellowship. If I were to ask you, what's the point of having a private corporation? Or if you were to start your own company, a profit-based company, why would you start a company? Why would you start your own private sector organization? Well, the answer obviously is because you want to maximize profits, right? You want to make profits, and that's why you establish a private sector organization. That's why you have a startup, or that's why you have a grocery store, or whatever you wish to do. Your private sector undertaking is derived on the basis of profits. When you add this dimension to the concept of sustainable development, is where you get the concept of corporate sustainable development. Because a corporate entity is driven by profits and has to abide by sustainability. So when you add these two things together, what you get is corporate sustainability. So exactly, Fidel, and I'm coming to that question. I wish I had the exact answer to that question. I'd be surprised if anyone does, but I'm coming to that question. So businesses incorporate strategies that meet the needs of the enterprise and its stakeholders today, while hopefully protecting, sustaining, and enhancing the human and natural resources that will be needed in the future. But remember, now we're talking about needs of the enterprise, right? And its stakeholders. So the larger question is, how do you define stakeholders of a company that you run? How do you define stakeholders of your startup or your organization or your business venture? And there is the answer, or there is the question that should give you the answer to how do you include sustainable development in corporate strategies. There are a lot of definitions to this. I'm just going to skip over those and come to the concept of, actually, let me speak a little about the triple bottom line. So the whole world was taken by storm when Mr. John Elkington came up with the concept of triple bottom line. Now, bottom line is basically your net profits, right? That's what you're left with after all of your expenses is taken out of the picture. Now, triple bottom line surmised the concept that we do not only focus on profits, to answer Feren's remark as well. You also have to define economic, environmental, and social indicators to be seen as a profitable organization. So the 3 Ps, they call the 3 Ps, people, planet, and profits. That's how corporations look at profits now, or should ideally look at profits now. Now, Elkington became an absolute superstar when this happened, and for good reason. He is one of the most learned people on the topic. But something happened a couple of years back. I think in 2018, there was a Harvard Business Review article authored by Mr. John Elkington, where he said that I'd retract my concept of triple bottom line. Now, why did that happen? That happened because he saw that the people, the concept of triple bottom line was turned on its head and made into an auditing and accounting technique in which, as long as an industry, you can show that you've done something for the environment, something for the society, you can do whatever you wish to in terms of profits. And he disagreed with it, and he retracted this concept of triple bottom line. It still stays because it's at its core, it's a very sound concept where you're judging the company's performance by people, planet, and profits. But as I said, it was noticed that profits drive what your planet will be and what your people will be. All right. So this people, planet, and profit approach is what you see in ESG governance today, in any of the other auditing, environmental auditing techniques that are happening today. Now, to give you a bit of an indication of what is happening today, where do we stand? UN SDGs, as you understand, are fundamental to upgrade social and environmental accounting research agendas across the globe and across industries. Planetary boundaries and UN SDGs should be essential parts of corporate sustainable accounting. It requires a framework that is based on Global Reporting Initiative, which is a different Pandora's box altogether. If you look at the history of Global Reporting Initiative, performance indicators and scoring systems to compare and assess UN SDGs through corporate sustainability reports. And the most difficult question to answer in this sphere, and again, I'll try and end this with this thought for all of you. But say I'm working in a corner of rural India, okay? And say you're working in Upper East Side, Manhattan. Your idea of standardized ESG auditing or people, planet, profit auditing will be very different from my idea of people, planet, profit auditing. Now it becomes even more difficult when I remove myself from India and put myself in Marshall Islands or Fiji or any of the Pacific Islands. Because now the elements of people and planet take a lot more precedence over profit. So how do you bring about a standardization of approaches where you can hold someone accountable for the kind of environmental impact that they're having, the kind of social impact they're having, and the kind of profits they're deriving? Because please do not get me wrong. I'm not saying that profits are not important, only people and planet are important, because if we say that you're not allowed to have profits, if we say that you only have to concentrate on people and planet, I have no impetus to innovate. I have no impetus to have my own business. I have no impetus to come up with a venture that provides employment, hopefully that transcends into education and general well-being, right? So profits are important, but how do you come up with a matrix that standardizes profits? And on a scale of 1 to 10, everyone, every country, every industry, every sector could be judged. And that's the problem. Now we explore these questions and many. As I said, I promised that there is a pizza conundrum slide that I have for all of you, but we'll probably discuss this at length if you end up coming to the GPODS fellowship. But I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm sorry I had to cut this short, but we were running out of time, and I'm very conscious of everyone who's joining us. And some of you would be starting on your work days or Saturday brunches, and I don't want to be holding you for it. But if there are any questions that you'd like to answer, that you'd like answered, or any thoughts that you might have about the kind of things that we discussed. So let me also tell you while I await questions, I had actually prepared a presentation on, as I said, policy repercussions on environment. But I think we can leave that to the GPODS fellowship, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss that today. But just to give you an example, something as simple as an FSI policy, a floor space index policy. Now, unless you're a land lawyer, you probably haven't heard of this, but the building that you're joining in from today, whichever part of the world you're joining in from, the height of that building is based on this concept of floor space index. Floor space index is the FSI value of your locality that defines the height of your building, or the number of people who stay in that building, or that typically defines what will be the built up area on the piece of land on which that building exists. Now, as soon as the built up area of that land increases, the carrying capacity of that land decreases. As soon as the built up area decreases, the rents go up, the prices of real estate goes up, and that leads to, in the case of developed economies, suburban sprawls, transportation, such things. In the case of less developed economies, it leads to slums and pockets of unplanned habitation. And each of those things have a terrible, terrible impact on environment. As I said, I have a whole lecture prepared on this, so I would not dwell any longer on this. But yeah, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those. I'm just checking if there are any. Yeah, so prosperity. In fact, Christopher, that's a very, very good point. One of the slides that I have in this presentation is how it has been suggested. I think it came from OECD countries as well, that profits could be replaced by the concept of prosperity, because prosperity is more holistic. Yes, our common future is the Brundtland report. That's correct. Brundtland Commission was established in 1983 with a specific agenda, and 87 is when it came out. 89 it was adopted. Ishwarya, I'm not an IR expert. I'm a sustainability expert. I'm not even sure if a public forum is the right way to answer that question, but I'm sure there is some merit in what you're asking. I'm happy to have a conversation on each of these things separately as well. All right, so because we had to keep it short, I have had to cut down my session, but I'm happy to address any questions or take these conversations outside of this meeting as well. So I'm just putting in, and I'll come to you, Sylvia, just 1 second. I'm just putting in my email ID. You could reach me directly at this. I'm also on LinkedIn, and obviously the website you could reach us through. Yes, Sylvia, you could, I think I'm, yeah.
So just going back to your pizza analogy, and I think this comes down a lot to the cultural environment and also the economic environment. I'm Eastern European at my origin. I'm from Romania, which is an extraordinarily rich country in resources. However, the country was sold secondhand after the communist system fell, because the former communists managed to create their own, political parties and convince the population that they are the answer. And ever since the 1990s, the country's resources went all around the West, and they are still being given to the West for God knows how little money. So I think maybe with the pizza analogy, if I go home or my partner comes home and he tells me we've got guests, my first question will not be, or maybe my second question would probably be, can we afford buying pizza rather than cooking with what we've got at home and create a really lovely homemade meal. You understand my analogy, don't you?
It's a perfect analogy, Sylvia, and it's a very good, because what you have done is basically answered the question of the pizza conundrum. So the pizza conundrum, the answer to that pizza conundrum is, do not order pizzas, limit yourselves to the resources that you have available. And this is actually
or you can make a homemade pizza with everything that you've got, you know, and just share it between everyone. And that's whole, you know, sense of sharing and being together, I think can bring groups as well. And what I do also struggle with is this idea with corporate business actually being towards the good of the population. That is going to probably happen within the next 1,000 years or so, or the second coming of Jesus, because it's improbable.
No, it's improbable, and I think also, yeah, go ahead.
I personally, from all my experience on 36 years on Earth, corporations very rarely, unless they're extremely ethical businesses led by people with a character and a spine, they do not protect the interest of the mass or the masses. That does not happen. So I think that the issue is with this trickle-down economy, again, we are giving our power away, and we say to corporations, oh, we'll let you find a solution for sustainable development. Well, no, unless we are, as the public, involved, the corporations lead governments, and governments will always try to give us the impression that they're doing, whereas they're actually filling the pockets of corporations. So I think this is where maybe we as people should interject more and say no.
No, and I completely agree. And I also usually take this example that you cannot fault the corporations for not doing enough environmentally. And that's because if you today, as a human being, your primary natural instincts are to eat, sleep, breathe, procreate, those sort of things. That's what everything is driven towards. Now, if you incorporate, that's why I was making that point earlier, when you incorporate a private sector corporation, the sole objective of its incorporation is to make profits, right? So now to say that, listen, let's not talk about profits, let's talk about people and planet would be unfair. The sweet spot is where you can have enough self and implied governance through compliances that people and planet aspects of the 3 Ps do not suffer. And obviously no one's asking to stop making profits, but you have to do it in a conscious manner, which helps. Yeah, and another thing, Sylvia, is that SDGs is not just environment. SDGs is also rights of women. SDGs is also poverty. SDGs is so many things, and not just environment, because sustainability cannot be achieved without any of those 17 factors. In fact, there could be 19 or 20 factors. I truly think that SDGs have missed out on a couple of factors.
And also, you probably heard the saying that my freedom ends where your freedom begins. Yeah. So if we do want to create any kind of conditions for the future generations, as much as I maybe did not want to accept this when I was younger, there might be a certain generational divide when it comes to the principles and values that we incorporate at certain times and what we try to apply. So maybe the generation that's before me is trying to, you know, safeguard my future in a way that does not agree with my inner being and my integrity. Therefore, I need to say something, don't I? And we need to come to this dialogue whereby future generations are not just an abstract concept for whom we do things. No, we need to get that dialogue rolling and to, you know, look at everyone as equal stakeholders, basically. That's what it is. We're all stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. And with all stakeholders was on one of my slides as well. But to be fair and on an optimistic note, this has been happening. It's been happening very gradually, but now you have the Greta Thunbergs of the world, you have Tony Oposas of the world, all of whom are now having the next generation as a part of this equation. So now as a variable, you have people whose lives are actually at stake, and not just, you know, people of a certain vintage like myself who've lived through a certain amount of decades. Anyway, we'll go to Fidel. Fidel, did you have a question?
Well, I wanted to make an observation in the sense that, you know, I think what Sylvia was describing is this incredible amount of complexity that we actually have to deal with. And I think we very often want to land the problem with someone or something or corporation or this. Now, whilst I fully agree that there is greater responsibility, greater accountability, greater, you know, great, like corporations for sure, you know, they've done what they've done. But if I look at nature, a dog barks and a cat meows and a cow moos. And so they are these machinations of centuries and centuries of human development. And we, in a sense, every one of us, whether it is this tiny, tiny bit or huge part, we have had this contribution. And these are now the reflections of not necessarily just who they are, but who we are. So yes, maybe personally, I have a greater consciousness towards being ethical and being sustainable and whatever, but as a society, these are the reflections of who we are. So for me, at the, you know, the risk of keeping banging that same drum, it is absolutely important now that we as individuals reset what we value and what we want, and then together, because yes, I'm one grain of sand, and when I make that decision, it doesn't seem like I'm contributing significantly, but the moment that, but one grain, you can't have the beach of sand until you have the one grain of sand, right? So I'm connected to all of this, and every one of us in this room, you know, if we want to see change, for goodness sake, we've got to be that change. Because we're the ones, when we put that action together, yes, we will force policy changes. We will and I don't mean violently. I mean by every purchase we make, everything we create, everything we innovate. So, you know, it sounds kind of woo-woo and out there, but the change really does begin at home.
Well, I am half convinced that we should take that 30-second clip and play it on loop for everyone who ever joins GPODS, because I think that was very well articulated. But thank you, Fidel. I think I completely agree. I mean, it starts from you, and it does not end with you. That's the trend of sustainability. Anyway, guys, so that's it from our side. I hope you had a lovely evening / afternoon / morning. And I hope that we keep the conversation going. We are all very annoyingly approachable. So please feel free to reach out to all of us, any of us, and we'll be very happy to respond. And please do check out the GPODS Fellowship. We are very, very proud of the kind of network of future leaders we're creating. And I truly hope that you can be a part of it. So thank you. Please keep in touch and have a wonderful rest of the day.